Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and the sponsor for this episode is the Georgian Papers Program.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 175 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. You know, not so long ago, we spent a lot of time on this show exploring the American Revolution. In our Doing History to the Revolution series, we asked a lot of questions about the American Revolution, such as, what was the American Revolution? What caused the American Revolution? Who was the revolution for? And how do we remember the revolution? But one question we didn't explore in any detail was, what could the American Revolution mean for individual people and families? Today, we're going to take care of that because we're going to explore what the revolution meant for one specific family. We're going to explore how Benjamin Franklin and his family experienced the American Revolution and how the revolution caused a major rift between Franklin and his beloved son, William. Now, our guide for this exploration is Daniel Mark Epstein, author of The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. As we take a look inside Ben Franklin's family life, Daniel reveals details about the lives of Benjamin and William Franklin, the close relationship father and son shared before the American Revolution, and details about how the revolution shattered the close ties once enjoyed between the Franklin men. But first, do you like free books? Presses send the Omohundro Institute lots of books for us to feature on the podcast, and some presses actually send us extra copies of the books we do feature just so we can give them away to you. Our collection of books has reached a critical mass, which means it's time for another book giveaway. We're going to conduct the next book giveaway the first week of April. To participate, all you need to do is join our listener community on Facebook. Joining is free and easy. Just text BF World to 33444 and click the link for the group in the email I'll send you. Okay, are you ready to investigate the war the American Revolution caused in Ben Franklin's house? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an award-winning poet, biographer, and dramatist. He has received numerous fellowships in support of his work, including an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. And he's authored 20 books, 8 of which are biographies, including The Lincolns, Portrait of a Marriage, and, most recently, The Loyal Son, The War in Ben Franklin's House. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Daniel Mark Epstein.
Great to be with you, with like-minded historians.
Now, Daniel, I'm curious how you came to the topic of Benjamin and William Franklin, because you've written on a whole wide range of topics over your career. Abraham Lincoln, Bob Dylan, Nat King Cole, Aimee Semple McPherson. So what exactly drew you to the Franklins?
Well, Liz, from the time I was a child, I had a fascination with Benjamin Franklin. The most interesting of the founding fathers for me, because he seemed to be a man who could do anything. Self-taught man like Abraham Lincoln. A kind of an Odysseus figure who was so capable, so very capable and inventive and had a sense of humor. And I remember when I was a child seeing a woodcut of Benjamin Franklin flying the kite in the storm with his son, William. And I wondered, what would it be like to have a father like Benjamin Franklin? And so actually, first I wrote a poem about this. 20 years ago, I wrote a poem called The Lightning in the Key, which sets forth some of the themes that are in The Loyal Son. And the poem was very successful, and 20 years later, I thought, I'm going to go back to that because there's a lot of history there that should be reshaped.
There is definitely a lot of history there. And we can see this in Daniel's book, The Loyal Son 2, which begins with the mystery surrounding William's birth. Daniel, would you tell us about William Franklin's birth and who his parents were? I mean, we know his father was Benjamin Franklin, but who was his mother?
Benjamin Franklin's son William was born out of wedlock. When his father was 24, his father was not married then yet. And one of the best kept secrets in American history, or all of history in my opinion, was who was the mother of William Franklin. Because no one seems to have known other than the two of them. It was a very well-kept secret. To this day, we don't know. There's no indication that William himself knew who his actual birth mother was, or even Benjamin Franklin's wife, Deborah Reed, who some people believed was the mother of William, but she definitely was not.
Speaking of Deborah Reed Franklin, how did she receive the news that Ben had this son out of wedlock and now wanted to bring him to live with their family?
Oh, she was not happy about that at all. The circumstance of their courtship, Deborah Reed and Benjamin Franklin, was very interesting in itself. She was actually married when they were courting, and she was married when William Franklin was born. But for whatever reason, Benjamin Franklin could not marry the actual mother of his child. But Deborah Reed agreed, one of the conditions of their setting up housekeeping together, they couldn't really get married because her husband had disappeared and the laws of bigamy were such that they couldn't really get married. So they started this common law marriage, which was a little bit against Deborah's desires, but one of the conditions was that she agreed to raise this bastard son, William.
You said that Ben couldn't marry William's mother, even though he wasn't yet married at the time of William's birth. Do you have an idea about why he couldn't marry the mother of his child? Does the historical record have anything to say on that subject?
Well, my speculation, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I mean, first of all, how do you keep a secret like that pretty much forever? My guess, and I posit this in the introduction to The Loyal Son, is that William's mother was probably a woman of breeding and probably from a good family, and she may have even been a woman who was married. Thus, the secret would be as important to William's mother as it was to Benjamin Franklin. I think that's the only way to account for it. I don't think it was a woman of low birth or a woman of loose morals, because that sort of woman is less likely to keep that sort of secret. So that was my little addition to the theory of who William's mother was and how that secret was so well kept.
You know, today, when we think about parents having children out of wedlock, we often see the child remaining with its mother. Was it unusual for a man like Ben Franklin or any other man to take in and raise his illegitimate child as his own?
It was pretty unusual for a man of his social standing. Remember, he was very young. He was 24 years old, didn't have a lot of money. Aristocrats were known for adopting their bastard sons, not so often the daughters. But for a man of Benjamin Franklin's social standing and resources, it was pretty unusual for him to take on this responsibility. He obviously cared about the woman who was William's mother and felt a moral responsibility to take on parenting the child.
I'd like for us to explore William's childhood for a bit. Did the fact that Ben didn't have much of a childhood, I mean, his father Josiah apprenticed Ben to learn the printing trade at a young age. In fact, Josiah apprenticed Ben to Ben's elder brother James. And then Ben ran away to Philadelphia at the age of 17 to escape what he called abuse at the hands of his older brother. Did the fact that Ben had such a childhood impact the way he treated and raised his own son and later his daughter?
Well, they certainly were very different circumstances. When Benjamin Franklin was growing up in Boston, he actually admired his father. I don't think his father was abusive. And actually, the abuse of the brother has been rather exaggerated, although according to some sources, he beat Benjamin when Benjamin didn't mind his chores in the shop. But Benjamin Franklin grew up under very different circumstances from his son. And after Ben ran away from Boston and from his, quote, abusive brother who he was apprenticed to, he went to Philadelphia and created a life for himself that was really quite remarkable. He was a brilliant printer and very precocious and was taken up by the governor of Pennsylvania and quickly rose in his position as a printer for the colony of Pennsylvania. He was printing the currency by the time he was in his early 20s. He had his own printing company and newspaper and started publishing Poor Richard's Almanac by the time he was 25, 26 years old, and that made him rich. So William, who was born around 1730, grew up in an upper middle class household. And in those days, at that point in his life, people didn't even know he was a bastard. They assumed that Deborah Reed was his mother. So not only did he have resources in terms of education and growing up in a good home, he had a certain amount of prestige in the community because Benjamin Franklin was such a distinguished citizen, even in his late 20s.
So all those years ago, you wondered what it must have been like to have Ben Franklin as a father. What has your research into his and William's lives revealed to you on that subject? what was Ben Franklin like as a father to William?
Well, Benjamin Franklin describes himself as an indulgent father. I think that's accurate. I think he adored William. He had all of the wonderful qualities that one would like to see in a son. He was healthy, he was strong, he was brilliant. And I think Benjamin Franklin, who was very interested in education, saw this as an opportunity for him to try out some of his own ideas about educating a child. So that by the time William was in his 20s, a mutual friend of the two of them described the relationship as almost like a brother. They were as much like brothers as they were like father and son, which is very unusual. But he certainly adored him and gave William every opportunity to succeed in life.
Okay, so now we're going to jump forward a bit in time. By the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, which took place between 1754 and 1763, both Benjamin and William Franklin found themselves involved in the politics and military affairs of empire. And I'd like for us to explore both of these aspects of empire. So let's start with the role that both played in military affairs. Daniel, would you tell us how Ben Franklin came to lead the Pennsylvania Militia?
Let's begin with William. William, at age 15 or 16, we don't know exactly how old he was because we don't know exactly when he was born, he wanted to become a soldier. And his father, all of his father's advice could not dissuade him from doing that, and he went off and joined the British Army and fought in King George's War. This is the war before the French and Indian War, and was remarkably successful. He rose through the ranks and became a captain, which was the highest rank you could have without paying for it. So he was, by instinct and by training, he was a soldier. His father, on the other hand, his father was a printer and an inventor, but he was also a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And the massacres on the frontier during the 1750s and 1760s were so violent and oppressive that Benjamin Franklin created the first militia. And this was an outgrowth of his participation in the assembly. He saw a need, and so he created the first militia. Then later, during the French and Indian War, when Braddock came to America to lead the forces against the French and Indians, Benjamin Franklin and his son William were recruited as quartermasters to provide for the troops, to provide horses and wagons and food and so on. And then after Braddock's disastrous defeat in 1755, William and his father were engaged in creating a line of defense in the Lehigh Valley against the invasion of the French and Indians and built 3 forts there. All of this is kind of hard to imagine now because, we're used to professional soldiers taking these positions. But in those days, things were very fluid. And a man like Benjamin Franklin with extraordinary leadership abilities, who was in the Pennsylvania Assembly and saw this need, could quickly bring it about. And of course, everybody looked to him and saw this is a great leader. This is a man with engineering skills who can build forts. So he rose to the occasion. And his son, who had more formal military training, was his aide-de-camp.
From your response and from what I read in The Loyal Sun, it sounds like both Ben and William were actually very successful in their leadership of the Pennsylvania Militia. I mean, they built 3 forts.
Well, they were extraordinary. They really were. You have to realize that there really was no organization of the militia at that time. And the fact that they were able to raise troops and, gather the construction workers and so on that were necessary to build these 3 forts out on the frontier of Pennsylvania is extraordinary. And it was also very dangerous. So these were the men who knew how to use firearms. They knew how to organize men into effective fighting forces. And they also had the ability to build these forts, these 3 forts, which really were the envy of all of colonial America for years. Nobody could do anything comparable to it.
Now, during the 7 Years' War, the ties between military and political affairs were really intertwined, especially, it seems like, in the colony of Pennsylvania. Daniel, would you tell us about the intertwined nature of military and political affairs in Pennsylvania during the 7 Years' War?
The problem was raising the money to put troops or militia in the field. And according to the Charter of Pennsylvania, the Penns, who were the proprietors of Pennsylvania, were not required to pay taxes. And they still owned the majority of the land in Pennsylvania. They were by far the richest people in Pennsylvania with the most territory to defend. And all of the money that was being raised for the troops was coming from everybody else. well, this clearly was unfair. So there was this tension between the more aristocratic elements of Pennsylvania society and the working class, the farmers and the tradesmen and so on, who were mostly represented in the Assembly of Pennsylvania. So there was this huge tension between the Penns, the proprietors of Pennsylvania, and the common people, represented by the Assembly over this question of taxation. And that really was the crux of the conflict.
Did the Assembly and the Penns ever try to resolve the tension and difficulties between them?
Well, the Penns were very stiff-necked, and, they had the sense of what I guess we'd call the droit de seigneur. There was almost a feudal sense on the part of the Penns. They owned all this land, and they'd given what they wanted to the people, and they weren't going to give anything else because the Constitution, insofar as there was a Constitution, at the founding of Pennsylvania, did not clearly require it. So this was a huge bone of contention between the Penns and the more liberal people like the Franklins and the Quakers.
There were lots of tensions between the Penn family and the Pennsylvania Assembly. And I wonder if you would tell us how this dispute with the Penn family led the Pennsylvania Assembly to dispatch Benjamin Franklin to London in 1757, and also why Ben decided to take William with him on this mission.
Well, by 1757, the situation was desperate. The massacres on the frontier were so violent that, the colony really couldn't go on this way any longer. And the Penns wouldn't give up the money. They wouldn't be taxed and give enough money to mount a sufficient defense. And so the Assembly, which of course was independent of the proprietors in its way, they decided to send an agent to London to sue the Penns, insisting upon their paying their share of the taxes in order to support this army. And that was the reason they sent Ben Franklin to London. And his son, at that point, was in his mid-20s. He had been studying law with a tutor and wanted to get his credentials to be a full-fledged solicitor. And all of the great institutions of legal education were in London. So it all worked well. It made sense. Franklin couldn't do this by himself. He needed his son's help, and his son wanted to finish his legal education.
Now, how did the Franklins react to and manage their way around London society? I mean, these men came from Philadelphia, which was a good-sized city for colonial North America, but London was the large imperial hub and the largest city in the British Empire.
Well, Benjamin Franklin was famously adaptable and resourceful, and this is a man, you could throw him into any situation and he would survive. Now, remember, he had been in London when he was younger, several years before, so he was not a total stranger to the place. And he went there with a very specific assignment to get this result, to get the Penns taxed. And he had a certain amount of support by the time he arrived there from certain factions of the Parliament. So he had friends in London. He also was internationally famous by that time as a scientist. So there were a lot of scientists who welcomed him there and intellectuals. So there was a contingent of English society that really welcomed him. And William, as I said, was very charming. He was very good looking, had very good manners, and took to London society like a duck to water. And soon they were getting on quite well and, enjoying the London fashions and the London entertainments and the richness of London in the 1750s.
So how did the Franklins' quest to get permission for the Pennsylvania Assembly to tax the Penn family lands turn out?
Oh, it was an uphill battle because the Penns, of course, had a great deal of power and a great deal of wealth, and they did everything they could to lobby against the Pennsylvania Assembly and also to discredit Franklin himself. They said, this man is a liar and this man is not fit to be trusted with such an important embassy. And who is he, this lowly printer, to sue the mighty Penns? So it took years for them to mount the proper legal offense and to make the right connections in Parliament. There were several different court cases here, but eventually they did prevail. It took a couple of years.
The Franklins originally set out for London in 1757, and by 1762, Daniel claims that William Franklin, not Ben Franklin, but William Franklin, had become the most influential colonist in London. Daniel, would you tell us why you think that William Franklin became the most influential colonist?
Well, it's really psychologically interesting because the two of them in London sort of played bad cop and good cop. And Ben was the person to really put the pressures on the Penns and to make enemies. He was older, he was very aggressive in his lawsuit against the Penns, and made his share of enemies because the Penns, of course, had a lot of support as upper-class proprietors. William was in a very different position. Now, William was a student. William was his father's assistant, and he was, during his time in London then, he was groomed as a courtier. One of the definitions of a courtier is a person who knows how to flatter people, who knows how to work the system. So by the time they actually prevailed in the lawsuit in the early 1760s, Benjamin Franklin had made a lot of enemies, and his son, who was very handsome and charming, was still in very good favor and had probably more friends than Benjamin did. And in certain very important business matters, one example I make in the book is that while they were there, the Assembly of Maryland wanted to have an agent in London, just as Pennsylvania had an agent in London. So they approached Benjamin Franklin to set that up. And Franklin at that point said, I don't think I can handle this matter as well as my son. I'm going to turn it over to him. That's a very good example of how the balance of power had shifted, so that by 1762, not only is William getting invited to walk in the procession of the coronation, but very soon after that, he gets appointed as the royal governor of New Jersey. And all of this is quite remarkable, for a young man who is in his 30s.
Yeah, would you tell us how William Franklin came to receive his appointment as the royal governor of New Jersey?
Well, he'd been working his way up, in various diplomatic capacities. And I just mentioned his lobbying for Maryland to have an agent in London, just as Pennsylvania did. So he was working with the Undersecretary of State only months before he received this appointment as governor of New Jersey. And remember, there was a change of government when King George III, after his coronation, as people often do when there's a regime change, he demanded the resignation of all of the royal governors in the colonies. And one of the people who resigned was the governor of New Jersey. So there was an opening there, and William seemed like the right man for the job, and he got it.
And what did Ben Franklin think about his son's appointment?
I think he was surprised. There were people later, actually there are even biographers who believe that Benjamin Franklin had a hand in this, and there's absolutely no indication that he did. The calendar sort of defies that. The appointment occurred when Benjamin Franklin had already left London to return to the United States. And also, he did not have this sort of influence at that point that would have enabled that to happen. And you kind of get the feeling from the correspondence and the later interaction that he was cool on the idea. Benjamin probably would have preferred his son not to be in government. He would probably have preferred him to be a businessman. But that's about all we know about that.
Now, in 1762, both Benjamin and William Franklin returned home from London. And in 1764, Ben Franklin returned to London to once again try to persuade the British government to make Pennsylvania a royal colony. So Ben Franklin remained in London until 1775, while William Franklin served the British crown as the governor of New Jersey. We need to take a moment to talk about our episode's sponsor. And when we're done exploring the Georgian Papers program, we'll ask Daniel about these different experiences during the early days of the American Revolution. History and archival work go hand in hand. Letters, journals, and diaries are just some of the key records historians use to better understand the past. In fact, researchers will spend hours examining and transcribing all these different types of records, all to help them see particular moments of the past better. They may also spend lots of time and money traveling to archives to conduct their research too. Although now, research is getting a bit easier and a bit cheaper to do as more and more archives are digitizing their records and putting them up online so that anyone with a computer can examine them. In fact, the Omohundro Institute, the producer of Ben Franklin's World, is a primary partner in one such project to put the entire archive of the Georgian monarchs online. Locked for over a century in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle, the papers of the King Georges, George I, II, III, and IV, as well as of King William IV and all their family members and advisors, are now in the process of being digitized. And historians have only seen a small fraction of what is in these some 350,000 items in this collection. Now, the Georgian Papers program is actually a great opportunity for all fans of history, because soon you can explore these records for yourself, and you can help historians and archivists transcribe these handwritten documents as they continue to come up online. So if you enjoy exploring handwritten historical documents, you should sign up to be among the first in the Omohundro Institute's team of citizen transcribers. To become a citizen transcriber, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. Daniel, Ben and William Franklin had such different experiences at the start of the American Revolution. Ben was in London, William was serving in New Jersey. Would you tell us how these experiences led Ben and William, who really had such a close brother-like relationship, to diverge so much in their politics?
Well, you've just described exactly what happened. They ended up in entirely different worlds. William Franklin had been sent to be the representative of the king, and he really respected that. That to him was a great honor to serve the king. And there he was as royal governor of New Jersey during a very, very tumultuous decade in history when the colonies were, for very good reason, becoming restive and wanting to leave the empire, wanting to become independent. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin was in London trying to get Pennsylvania adopted, in effect, by the king to get the parliament out of the way. I mean, Ben, in a sense, during that decade, was a royalist, at least at the beginning of the decade. What happens? Things change very quickly. There's the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act riots that occur in 1765. There's the Boston Massacre in 1770, and then the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And by that time, the colonies are entirely in revolt. Benjamin Franklin has become not only the agent of Pennsylvania, but the agent of Massachusetts, which was the most revolutionary of the colonies. And, by the time of the Boston Tea Party, he was so in favor of independence that the British government was blaming the Boston Tea Party on Benjamin Franklin. So these two men who had worked together and they had been closely bonded in work and in life, in caring for the family, suddenly were in entirely different worlds. And this was going to lead to a tragedy.
Now, Ben Franklin did return to Pennsylvania in 1775. Did he and his son ever meet in person to discuss their political differences? I mean, surely they knew that each of them held different ideas about the imperial crisis, right?
Oh, they did, because the process of their going their separate ways really, it happened over a long period of time. As I mentioned, it took all of the 1770s. For a long time, both of them wanted compromise. They wanted America to remain in the empire, and they wanted the parliament to be reasonable and, stop these oppressive taxation acts and quartering acts and, sending soldiers to Boston. They were in favor of compromise. But by the time Benjamin Franklin came home in 1775, he had clearly communicated in his correspondence with his son that he wanted independence, and his son had clearly communicated to his father that he really wanted America to remain in the empire, and he believed that his father, by coming home in 1775, could persuade the Continental Congress not to declare independence. Both of them were, one of them was living in a dream world, for sure.
Like the tenure of so many royal governors in the 13 British American colonies, William Franklin's tenure as royal governor of New Jersey came to an end during the American Revolution. Daniel, would you tell us how William's tenure as governor ended?
Well, what happened, Liz, is all of the colonies during the 1775, 1776, around the time before the Declaration of Independence, all of the colonies set up provincial assemblies, which basically displaced the royal assemblies. And when that happened, the governors gracefully, and some of them in fear and trepidation, stepped down from their chairs in the colonial mansions. And many of them went to England. A few of them turned and became loyal to the new nation. William Franklin was the last royal governor to maintain his position in the governor's mansion. He refused to leave. And so he was declared a traitor. And he said, "You'll have to carry me out of here." And they did, and declared that he was a traitor and eventually imprisoned him.
William's story is very similar to a lot of stories from the Revolution. I mean, yes, he was a royal governor, which makes him a bit different. But when I look at the historical records for the period, many committees declared people inimical to the cause and then ordered them to be sent to Connecticut, which is exactly what happened to William Franklin. Daniel, would you tell us why the Continental Congress ordered the revolutionary government of New Jersey to send William Franklin to Connecticut?
Well, because the cause of independence was still sufficiently divisive that there were a lot of loyalists. This was not a unanimous decision to leave the empire, and the estimates are that maybe a third of the American populace, by 1776, a third was in favor of independence, a third was entirely against it, and a third was neutral. So a man like William Franklin, who had really been a very, very good governor and was highly respected, really was dangerous to the founding fathers. He was a danger to independence because he was in the position to lead the opposition and even to sway opinion in that third part, and there were a lot of those people in New Jersey, and turn them against independence.
Now, we know that Benjamin Franklin went on to serve the Continental Congress and the new United States in Paris. His service led to both the treaties of amity and commerce in 1778 and the Treaty of Paris 1783, which ended the war. Daniel, what was William Franklin's wartime experience like? How did William experience the American War for Independence?
Well, by 1776, he was in jail. So part of the War of Independence, from 1776 to 1778, 1779, he was definitely a spectator. He had a certain amount of freedom. He could write letters from where he was until he ended up in the prison in Litchfield. And that really was a horror. That was solitary confinement and absolutely no communication with the outside world. He did not know what was going on when he was in Litchfield prison. Now, when he was released, which was a very complicated business that involved George Washington and Lafayette and his brother-in-law, when he was released, he finally was allowed to go to New York City, which was then entirely controlled by the British. And he lived there for the rest of the time that he was in the United States till, 1782. And while he was in New York, led a counter-revolutionary movement. So that was his experience during the war.
You mentioned that before William was confined to the Litchfield prison, he was allowed to write letters. Did he ever try to write to his father about his situation during the war?
No, he didn't. Both father and son realized the danger to the rest of the family by the two of them communicating. It was politically unsound, politically disastrous once the war started for Benjamin Franklin to acknowledge that he had any communication or sympathy with his son, who was considered a traitor. Ben's responsibilities were so enormous that he could not be compromised by having any communication with his son. And on his side, William Franklin respected that, and he knew he did not want to put his father or his son in danger or the rest of the family. So they mostly observed this silence.
Okay, so the Franklins didn't try to write each other during the war, but Ben Franklin was someone who could gather a lot of intelligence because he had impressive political and social networks. Did Ben ever try to use his networks to keep tabs on his son and his wartime experiences?
Yeah, I have a lot of reasons to believe there's a lot of evidence that Benjamin Franklin was very concerned about his son's welfare during the war. And there were plenty of friends. Robert Morris, who was the great financier of the war and a very close friend of Benjamin Franklin's, he was in a position in Pennsylvania, in the Continental Congress, he was in a position to know how William was doing, where William was. There were others. Lafayette, I think I mentioned before, Lafayette was a friend of Benjamin Franklin's. I discovered evidence that there was communication between William Franklin and Lafayette was a very good friend of Sarah, William's sister. So, there are enough strands here to suggest that communication was, if not easy, it was possible, discrete communication.
As we've discussed throughout our conversation, Ben Franklin was a clever guy. And while he may not have been able to help his son directly, I wonder if there is any evidence that he tried to alleviate William's suffering indirectly.
There's not direct evidence. And I try to make a case in the book that there was communication. There were enough friends of Benjamin Franklin's who were in a position to help his son. And these people would not have gone against Benjamin Franklin's will or desires. So in other words, if he hadn't approved of Robert Morris's intervention, if he hadn't approved of his son-in-law's intervention, those things would not have happened. And it's possible that William Franklin never would have gotten out of prison. That's really the tentative argument that I make in the book.
After the war ended in 1783, did Benjamin and William Franklin who was now exiled to England. Did father and son ever try to reunite and see each other again, or at least restart their correspondence after the war?
Yes, they waited for a year or 2 years. But remember, William Franklin's son, William Temple Franklin, was in his grandfather's care through the entire war. And this young man was beloved of the grandfather and of William Franklin. And when Ben was in France, he sent William Temple Franklin to go and visit his father. So there was that connection. And that sort of opened an awkward communication between father and son, because Benjamin was still furious at William. He later wrote, "Nothing has ever hurt me so much in my old age to have my son turn against me in this terrible, terrible way." Nevertheless, they did see each other one more time when Benjamin Franklin finally decided to go home, actually when the Continental Congress finally allowed him to return home in 1783. On his way back, he stopped at the Isle of Wight en route to get a ship back to America, and he had a meeting with William, which was mostly about financial matters. In fact, the surroundings of that particular meeting are very suspicious, and they don't reflect very well on Benjamin Franklin, because you get the sense that William really wanted a reconciliation, and what his father wanted was for William to deed over to William Temple Franklin almost all of his property in America. So it's a very sad last meeting, because there really was no reconciliation. There was just Benjamin Franklin, trying to convince his son, and he did convince him, to give the property they had in America to Temple Franklin.
Wow. It really sounds like Benjamin Franklin took his son's political stance during the Revolution personally.
Well, he did. And, at a certain point, it's very difficult to distinguish how much was personal and how much was political. Benjamin Franklin believed that natural affection in this particular case should have overridden political opinions. He expected his son to go along, or at least step down, and not be so forcefully, aggressively against his father and against his father's cause. And he never really forgave him for that. And there are deeper reasons that are revealed in the book about why Benjamin Franklin could not forgive his son, and he never did forgive him. One of the most terrible moments, really, in the story is when Benjamin Franklin makes up his will and leaves his son completely out of it, saying, I leave my son no more than he attempted to deprive me of, which was basically nothing at all, cut him out of his will.
Daniel, now that you've had the opportunity to really study and investigate the relationship that Benjamin had with his son William, why do you think it's an important relationship for us to explore and grapple with today? How does Benjamin Franklin and William Franklin's relationship help us better understand the American Revolution?
Well, this story is it's a perfect intersection of the private worlds of the people who were living at the time and the larger political forces that were at work, because it's all happening in one family. As I say, the war in Ben Franklin's house. It's an opportunity to see how personal this was. It really was a civil war, like the great Civil War of the 19th century, in which brother was set against brother and father against son. And it's an opportunity to see this under a microscope, because there's so much evidence, there's so many letters. It's a perfect opportunity to see the real human toll that a political complication and a political environment can take on one family, and not to mention an entire nation.
Okay, now we should jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Benjamin and William Franklin had supported the same side during the American Revolution? Which side do you think they would have supported, and how might the history of the American Revolution have been different?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that if they both had gone to one side, it would have been the side of the revolution. And there are a number of reasons for it. It's a great question. It's a lot of fun to think about this. First of all, you have two extraordinary men, Benjamin Franklin and William Franklin. One of them is a lawyer, that is William Franklin, with incredible powers of persuasion. And the other is Benjamin Franklin, who is a genius and a giant and a man of enormous willpower And I think that if one could have persuaded the other, it would have been Benjamin Franklin, partly because it would have been better for the family. Benjamin Franklin was, among other things, a visionary. I think he realized how this war was going to go eventually. So my feeling is, if one could have persuaded the other, it would have been Ben persuading William to come over to the side of the revolution. And if William had agreed to do that, the outcome would not have been different. America still would have achieved its independence, but there would have been far less suffering in the Franklin family and far less suffering really among the people of New Jersey, who basically endured a civil war that was promoted by William Franklin and his counter-revolutionaries in the early 1780s and even after Cornwallis surrendered. So what William ended up doing was not helpful to anyone. I mean, it was really quixotic and tragic, and I think everything would have been much better if he'd just gone along with his dad.
Daniel, you've written 8 biographies. Do you have a 9th in the works?
Oh, that's always a good question. And, I'm actually enjoying the contemplation of a new book rather than actually writing one. It took 6 years to write The Loyal Son, and I'm fascinated by this period. And George Washington makes a big appearance in this book. I haven't talked about him much today, but he's a very important figure in The Loyal Son. And I would love to write something about George Washington, particularly his military experience and his development as a general during the Revolution. So that's something I've been thinking about, but I'm not really sure at this point. I'll let you know when I'm certain.
If we have more questions about Benjamin and William Franklin, how can we contact you to pose them?
Well, I have a website, danielmarkepstein.com, and if you just go on Google and you Google all 3 names, that site will come up, and you can learn a lot there. I always recommend that people read my books. That's the best way to get to know about what I do, and I began my career as a poet, and I'm very proud of my poetry as well as the biographies. But if you want to get in contact with me, the best way is to write me a letter, and if you go to the website, you'll see an address there, and I would love to hear from you.
Daniel Mark Epstein, thank you for taking us through the relationship and revolutionary experiences of Benjamin and William Franklin.
Well, thank you for reading the book, and this really has been a pleasure to speak to somebody who sees the depths and the particulars of a time period that I've worked so hard to understand myself.
The story of Benjamin and William Franklin allows us to see just how personal the American Revolution could be for some of the people who lived through it. Different ideas about the revolution and its later goal for independence actually severed the bond between Benjamin and William Franklin, a bond that had been so close that people often mistook the Franklins for brothers, not father and son. Now, as Daniel revealed, the Franklins began to diverge in their viewpoints with regards to the British Empire during the 1760s. After working so closely together in London during the late 1750s and early 1760s, Ben and William Franklin actually began to live in 2 very different imperial worlds after 1764, when Ben returned to London on behalf of the Pennsylvania Assembly, and William remained in the colonies to serve as the royal governor of New Jersey. Now, like William, Ben was a royalist in 1764. He supported his king and empire. But as he witnessed the passage of the Stamp Act, the reactions to the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, and the Boston Tea Party all happened from the imperial capital, Ben changed his views. As the colonial agent for both Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, Ben had to argue and advocate for why Parliament's taxation measures were detrimental and unlawful. And just as Ben's experiences with the Revolution caused him to drift toward the revolutionaries, William's experiences caused him to drift further toward staunch loyalism. Whereas Ben witnessed the increasing violence of the Revolution from afar, William witnessed it on the ground and had to deal with it, all while upholding his oath to defend and support the crown. And just as Ben argued and advocated for why Parliament's taxation measures were detrimental and unlawful, William had to argue for their need and lawfulness as he tried to implement them in New Jersey. By 1775, it was clear to both Franklins that they were at an impasse in their politics. And this impasse caused an irreparable rift between father and son. The Franklins never reconciled after the war. As we discovered in the Doing History to the Revolution series, the American Revolution was a big, large event. At times, it was a very violent event. But the violence of the event wasn't just confined to the protests in the streets or to the seas and on the battlefields. The violence of the revolution reached inside the homes of people like the Franklins and fractured their family's relationships. Look for more information about Daniel, his book, The Loyal Son, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/175. If you love history and want to explore some of the documents people from the past left behind, you should join the Omohundro Institute's team of citizen transcribers and help them transcribe the papers of the King Georges. To sign up, visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. Finally, what do you think about the impact the American Revolution had on the Franklins? Personally, I really just can't get over how tragic it was, and it's something I'm still thinking about. I'd love to know what this bit of history is causing you to think about, so please drop me a line, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.